Okay, so I'm going to try and speed up. Sorry, again, this is stuff I really enjoy, so it's very hard for me to not be thrown off. The big problem, kind of to sum up, the big issue with this world's approach is impossible fictions. So impossible fictions are fictions that include seemingly impossible propositions. So that can either be logical contradictions or metaphysical impossibilities. So for example, as a metaphysical impossibility, a lot of people think that kind essentialism is true. That is, if you're an instance of, say, the kind being human, you couldn't be turned into a bug, say, or a vermin. In which case, right, metamorphosis is an example. Or another one is, to use the same kind of case, right, the Odyssey would be one. Other kind of fun ones are cases where you have fictional characters walking off the film screen, engaging with the audience, so jumping from the world of the fiction directly to the actual world, these kinds of things, or from one fictional world to another, broadly. An excellent example of this is Priest's Sylvan's Box. It is specifically designed as an impossible fiction, as a kind of epitaph, I guess, for his friend Richard Sylvan. The long and the short of the story is kind of fun, but what you end up with is this kind of box that's supposedly entirely empty and also has this weird little statue inside. And it's labeled as an impossible object. And what's very important for the story is that Priest and another character in the story, because Priest is writing this as one of the characters as well as the author, right? They both see it, they're both surprised by it. They end up doing two different things with the box. Priest buries it in the backyard. The other character puts it in his trunk and drives away. But they both are startled by the fact that the box has something in it and is empty. What's important is they're not startled by the fact that the box is empty, and they're not startled by the fact that there's something in the box. It's the conjunction. Keep that in mind. So impossible fictions are an issue for this account. Lewis attempts to address this, and he attempts to address this in two ways. The first step for both of these is the same. You take the story and you break it into consistent fragments. So for Sylvan's Box, you take one path where, like, Priest looks at the box, is surprised, then buries it in the backyard. The other consistent fragment is the other character, whose name I've forgotten, right, is surprised by the box and then puts it in his trunk and drives away. There's more that happens, but those are the important things, right? You take the consistent fragments, and now with those consistent fragments, you can do two different things. The first one that Lewis proposes is what he calls the method of intersection. So you take the consistent fragments, you compare what's true in each, and then what will be true in the actual impossible fiction is the stuff that's true in both. So that's true in the overlap between the two. It's worth noting that this will even further reduce the stuff that's fictionally true. So you won't end up with it being true in the fiction that the box is empty, or it being true in Sylvan's Box that the box has something in it. Because those aren't true in the overlap, those are only true in one part or the other. Lewis didn't like it. He thought this was too restrictive. So he proposes a second way, which is the method of union. And the method of union, what you do, again, split into consistent chunks, and then what will be true in the original fiction is what's true in even one consistent fragment. So you get then, using the method of union, because it will be true in one consistent fragment that the box has something in it, that will be true in Sylvan's Box. You also get, because it's true in a different fragment, that the box is empty. So you get occupied is true and empty is true. Here's something weird. You don't get the conjunction. You don't get the conjunction because the conjunction is not true in any fragment. One conjunct is true in one fragment, the other conjunct is true in the other fragment, but the conjunction of the two is not true in any fragment. Do we see that? It's very important. Yeah.
So we're talking about possible worlds, but couldn't we just say there is no possible world in which this is the case?
Yeah. So you could include impossible worlds. This is another way to go. Right? This is a possibility. Right? Lewis just really didn't want to do that. Because again, he thinks possible worlds are these giant concrete objects, and if you have any impossible things out there in modal space, their impossibility would infect us. So his particular metaphysics blocks this. You could allow for impossible worlds, and in fact, this is a kind of extension of it. Yeah?
And what is the difference with Schrödinger's cat?
Yeah, good. So that's another potential one. Though in that case, depending on how you read the case, you can see this as an issue about epistemology. So it's that we don't know whether the cat's alive or dead. You can also, if you read it in the more kind of metaphysically loaded case, it's indeterminate whether the cat's alive or dead, and then maybe it'll turn into a kind of weirdness here. But indeterminacy is one thing, and inconsistency could be another. Right? A silly case, right? It's indeterminate where the mountain begins, right? Because, okay, does it start in the foothills? Does it start just where the foothill ends and the mountain begins? How far down? Yeah, you see the idea, right? So indeterminacy and incompleteness or inconsistency can be read in different ways. But intersection, again, not so satisfying. Union gives you the individual things as true, but you never get the conjunction. This is very strange, because Lewis tells us early in the paper that truth in a given fiction is closed under implication. And since we know that P is true in F and not P is true in F, it should be that their conjunction is also true in F, but he cannot have that.
The first one is a capital F, I guess.
Either way. Right. All that matters is the F here is picking up the fiction. And importantly, according to Priest, this gets it fundamentally wrong. Why does it get it wrong? Well, the story, when Priest and the other character are surprised by the box, they're surprised that it is both empty and has something in it. They're not surprised that it's empty, and they're not surprised that it has something in it. So union not only doesn't give you the conjunction, but it makes no sense of why they're surprised. So the upshot is that this worldly account, if we use just possible worlds, leaves us slightly wanting when it comes to impossible fictions. There are some fixes. We can allow impossible worlds. That is an option. Turns out that those are kind of weird. They behave strangely, but it's an option. We could deny the possibility of impossible fictions. Perhaps it turns out that whenever we have these, it's only an unreliable narrator. That's actually Nolan's proposal for how to deal with these. Or we can just dig our heels in and say, look, these two methods are the best you're going to get, so just be happy with the kind of results we can go for. And there's reasons for each one of these. I just want to kind of gesture at them. But these impossible fictions are the kind of big reason or big worry for these worlds-based accounts. So let's talk about the other big account, this kind of big semantic approach, which is this Waltonian approach. So the run-up to that involves thinking about the very broad project from Kendall Walton. Best expressed in his 1990 book, Mimesis is Make-Believe. Walton's overarching project is to make sense of representational works. Not necessarily representational artworks, but those will be included too. So Walton thinks that engaging with representational works involves imagining. That is, you have to do some kind of act of imagining to go from the representation to what it is meant to represent. You see the bicycle seat and the bit of frame, and then you imagine that it's a bull skull. Right? What's important with this imagining is that it is not directed at truth. We can contrast this act of make-believe with believing. Right? As he puts it, beliefs, unlike imaginings, are correct or incorrect. Belief aims at truth. What's true and only what is true is meant to be believed. We're not free to believe as we please, at least if we're following norms of belief. Right? So it may seem, right? We are free to imagine, to make believe as we please. So it may seem, but it isn't quite so. Imaginings are constrained also. Some are proper, appropriate in certain contexts, and others are not. So a big step is going to be explaining when are imaginings appropriate or inappropriate. To do this, we've got to talk a little bit about his broad framework. So, Walton thinks again, engagement with representational works involves make-believe. Specifically, we play games of make-believe. They're games similar to, though potentially more sophisticated, than the kinds of games that children play. So, kids play a game of like, hey, let's imagine that the stump is a bear. And then they run around and like, oh no, the bear's going to get us, right? They're pretending, they're make-believing that the stump is a very, very immobile bear. Right? Or they play cops and robbers, right? Bang, I got you. No, you didn't. Da, 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 right? A lot of it involves negotiating the rules and outcomes of the game. So, kind of running with this, what we do when we engage with representational works is that we imagine certain things are the case, and what we imagine will be true in the game world. Better, just true in the game. And there are things that constrain what we're meant to imagine. Two parts. There's what we'll call props. Props are actual objects, physical objects, could be abstract as well, right? Whose properties, existence, etc. guide and determine what we're meant to imagine. The location of the stump tells you where you're meant to imagine the bear. The color of the puppet tells you that you're supposed to imagine it's a brown bear. These kinds of things. The props features, actual features, guide your imagining. They restrict it in some way. Along with these props, you have what we'll call principles of generation. They're effectively rules that fix prescriptions to imagine. And there's three types. There can be more as well, but these are the three main ones. You have a conditional one, right? Conditional says something like, if stump is located there, then you're prescribed to imagine bear is located there. There's direct, which you just say, imagine there's a bear in the room. Let's go. And there's supplemental. We might have things like, hey, if you're prescribed to imagine that there's a bear in the room, imagine that it's, I don't know, a polar bear, just to make it extra scary. So all of these are just kind of rules to restrict, restrain, guide the game of make-believe. We do this sort of thing again with the games with kids. Right? Hey, I'm imagining I've got a rocket pack. You're not supposed to be doing that. We're playing cops and robbers in real life rather than like space cops and robbers. So this gives us a way to characterize when these acts of imagining are authorized or not. The game of make-believe is authorized if and only if it follows the associated principles of generation. That is, the prescriptions to imagine are satisfied by the game that you play. So imagination isn't going to be completely chaotic, it's guided. What guides it? The prompts and the principles of generation associated. Yeah?
And then, well, speaking of a certain type fluid, Alice in Wonderland. That is where chaos is the rule of imagination, if I'm not mistaken. So there it is.
So the nice thing in that game, right, when we play the Let's Read Alice in Wonderland game, we can kind of evoke a bunch of things. But note, even then, we still have to have certain things that are restricted. There's got to be Alice. There's the Cheshire Cat. There's the Red Queen. They say certain things, right? We can supplement and add on in that, but the book itself serves as a prop to restrict what we're prescribed to imagine in these cases, right? We can continue the game in many ways, but the game itself is delivered at least partially unto us. So we get this idea of, we call them Walt fictions. Walt fictions are like fictions, but they're way fucking broader. Because a Walt fiction is any kind of artifact or work whose function is to serve as a prop in a game of make-believe. So Walt fictions are going to include lots of things. Paintings, books, puppets, maps, language itself, if we think language is representational. And we get then an account of when something is true according to a fiction. P is true in Walt fiction F, if and only if F prescribes imagining P. So this gives us a different way to characterize the content of fictions. Holmes is a detective because the Holmes game of make-believe includes a prescription to imagine that Holmes is a detective. And why is Holmes as a detective kind of true and kind of false? Well, if you're playing the game, it's true. If you're not playing the game, it's false. And you might be unsure about whether we're playing the game at a given moment or we're outside of the game. So it gives us a kind of different way to capture the same basic thought, a different semantics for in the fiction P. Now, one immediate problem with this Waltonian picture is how do we make sense of secondary fictional truths? Right? Because most of the prescriptions to imagine are going to just involve or concern explicit truths. So what do we do about the implied and the imported? Well, with regards to the implied, we can take what we're prescribed to imagine and then apply our inference rules not to the prescription to imagine, but the content inside. There's a problem, though. Which rules we're allowed to use need to also be prescribed by the fiction. This comes back to the Alice in Wonderland point, right? We're not allowed to make certain inferences in every fiction because the fiction itself has different inferential rules than we might have in real life. The stuff you can make inside the game versus the stuff you can make outside the game might be governed by different entailment relations. Similar point with the imported content, right? The fiction may not specify what you're meant to import. And when it doesn't specify what you're meant to import, you're kind of screwed. Because there's not a prescription to imagine this imported content. So you have some suggestions for people who step in. Stacy Friend, for example, has put forward what she calls the reality assumption. This is different from the RP principle that we had before, which was this kind of counterfactual notion. This one is, right, everything that is true is fictionally the case unless excluded by the work.
So how's the difference?
Good. So when it came to this kind of thing, it's this counterfactual. It's what would obtain if every primary truth were the case. So we're going to use the actual world as a way to kind of figure out how to read the counterfactual, but we don't, strictly speaking, have to. Because the second account also uses the reality principle, just instead of taking what's actually true, you start from the overt worlds of belief. So that's the kind of difference here, right? There we go. In this case, it's what are you meant to import? Everything. Everything that doesn't conflict with the explicit stuff, versus where do you start? You can start from the actual world, which is then something that's going to line up with this, or with the overt belief worlds.
Is the rise is different than assumption 1, where you also take the real world?
Oh, analysis 1.
Yes.
Yeah, good. So one thing, note, we're not getting anything like sets of worlds. It's just about what's the prescribed to believe, or make believe, rather, prescribed to make believe. So it's probably, if you buy this, going to end up very similar to analysis 1, but it might also allow for impossibilities. You can have a prescription to imagine impossibility, even though there's no way to fit that in. Yeah, we'll come to that in a second, right? Even though there's no way to fit that into the Lewis picture. The problem with this is that it leads to some very strange results, right? If we buy Friend's reality assumption, it's true in the Very Hungry Caterpillar make-believe game that we had a class today. That's a bit weird.
Is it weird? If we're role-playing a polar bear later, then I mean it's not weird if I refer to the class we had earlier.
That's certainly true, but note that it will be true in this game that we had a class, right?
Yeah, okay, also for completely different
reason. Sorry, it's true in Oedipus Rex that we had a class today.
That's not strange, right? I mean, that's right.
It's weird, but it's less problematic than the issues we ran into with Lewis, I will say.
So the broad thought is, right, we're going to import every actual truth. Here's another one, as a kind of, just to give you an example. It will be true in the Very Hungry Caterpillar that the Americans dropped an atomic bomb on Nagasaki. That's a weird thing to be teaching kids about with a Very Hungry Caterpillar.
Right, sequel, Very Hungry Caterpillar goes to Nagasaki. I mean, it would be weirder if the city was still standing, right?
Yeah. But I think, so here's the thought. You can read it either as kind of filling in everything, or, as I think is much more plausible, the fiction's just, it doesn't say anything about this. So it's not, this is too strong, it brings in too much, is the thought. But again, at least what these show is that this initial kind of characterization is too weak. It doesn't get what's actually true in a fiction. Because there's going to be lots of things that are true that are not being prescribed to imagine, at least not in any principle of generation. But we can still handle incompleteness, because there'll be lots of propositions that were neither prescribed to make believe nor prescribed to make believe its negation. It's just, there is no prescription here, right? Should you have, well, actually, that's a bad example. We'll skip that. There can be prescription gaps. Can it handle impossible fictions? Is it better than the world's account in that case? Well, in one sense, sure. We can just say impossible fictions prescribe imagining contradictory content. In another sense, you might be really worried about how you satisfy that prescription. We might not be able to. And this is where we get connections with debates about imaginative resistance. So imaginative resistance is where you're invited to imagine something and the imaginative activity fails. This can either be because we're a Kantian, that is, we can't imagine the content for whatever reason, or a Wontian, where you just will not, you refuse for whatever reason. And there's different kinds of accounts here, but it's worth just sort of gesturing. This, if you buy these kinds of worries, this is an issue for Walton 2. So what we have is two very broad views. This worlds-based account, which tries to analyze the contents, gives the semantics in terms of sets of worlds, runs into problems with impossibility and filling out the secondary truths. We talked about this Waltonian approach, which runs into problems with filling out the secondary truths and potentially with impossible fictions. I want to gesture at some remaining weirdness, and I'll go very fast here because we don't have very long. Sorry about that. So the first two things to gesture at is stuff we mentioned in discussion, and I mentioned the bottom one once, but we'll highlight them. The first one's a big problem with the explicit content. So this is sometimes called the says-is gap, right? The fact that the text explicitly says something doesn't make the associated proposition definitely true in the fiction. There's a kind of slightly boring case of this where we have unreliable narrators. So the text tells us P, but the narrator, the storyteller, is unreliable. It is not the case that P is true in the fiction. Note that that's really weird because every way we've talked about figuring out the other content involves taking into account the explicit content, but now we're using some of that secondary stuff to undermine explicit content. Hard. A more interesting, I think, puzzle is alethic cases, where the author isn't, or the narrator isn't unreliable, but their attempt to introduce something fails. This goes hand in hand with that kind of Kantian account of imaginative resistance. If there's some propositions that you simply cannot fictionalize, then the author trying to put those in would be a case of this. It's authorial breakdown. So that's a problem with the primary content. The secondary content, we can just really bluntly ask, cool, when we do the implied content, what's the entailment relation we're supposed to use? And a big issue here is it doesn't seem like there's a consistent or universal fiction or logic to be applied. Different closure relations seem to apply for different fictions. For example, right, P and not P look like it's true in Sylvan's box. Box is empty, box is not empty. But we can't derive everything. Not absolutely everything occurs. So cool, this can't be closed under classical entailment. But other fictions are obviously closed under classical entailment. What do we do? Something that's near and dear to my heart is this question of, is there a limit to fictional truths? Is there an upper limit, like a kind of maximum number of propositions we could have true in a fiction? And is there a lower limit? Is there a minimum number? And I want to say no and no. So at the heart of this debate is this principle of poetic license. For any group of propositions, there's some fiction where all of those propositions are true, are fictionally true. If the principle is true, then I think you'll be able to get universal fictions. That is, fictions according to which every possible proposition is true in that fiction. My buddy and I have also given a recipe for this. You basically get a fiction where a contradiction is explicitly mentioned, so it's part of the primary content. You make sure that the fiction is closed under classical entailment, and then explosion gives you absolutely everything.
Could the fiction also just be everything is true?
So one of the things that's weird about that is that everything, that universal quantifier, only ranges over whatever propositions are kind of already in the fiction. So you can't bootstrap everything in, whereas this kind of explosion rule is sentential, so it gives you everything. But this is something, yeah, it's hard. The other side, the kind of empty fictions are fictions where nothing is true. No propositions are fictionally true. And this is dirty, but what you can do is define a kind of complementation relation to generate a new fiction where you take something and P will be true in your to-be-produced fiction if and only if it's not true in the one that you're complementing. So if you take your universal fiction as the complement and then build a new one off of it by taking only the stuff that's not true in it, you end up with nothing. Which is a very easy fiction to write. It's very hard fiction to read. Again, these are kind of broad things. This is gesturing at these issues about impossible fictions and are there some kinds of restrictions here. Another really quick one, I'm going to go very fast here, I'm sorry, I've already hit the time. Right? We also have these cases of embedded fictions. So this is where you've got a big frame fiction and inside it, there is another fictional story. Generally, these are kept distinct, but sometimes there's a collapse. That is, sometimes content that's true in the frame will also be true in the embedded one, and potentially vice versa, but not always. A kind of related one are metafictions. This is where fictions acknowledge their own fictionality state. So, according to the terrible privacy of Maxwell's Sims, or Sim, right? The book itself is mentioned in the book, and they read it to kind of figure out what's going to happen next. It's a bit like Spaceballs, if those of you have seen that, right? That's one where they acknowledge that it is a fiction, right? And it ends with the author showing up and being like, yeah, I'm done with this. I don't want to do this anymore. You also get the case I mentioned earlier, where the characters of At Swim Two Birds decide to try and murder their despotic author by bringing him into the fiction and then killing him, which is what they do in the story. Here's the last one that I want to talk about. Serial fictions are fucking crazy, and they're really hard to make sense of. So serial fictions are ones where you have multiple episodes of a kind of broader piece. So we can just focus on two. We've got A New Hope and Empire Strikes Back. New Hope came out in 1977. Empire Strikes Back, 1980. Here's the fun question. Is it true in A New Hope that Darth Vader is Luke's father? There's a reason to say yes. There's a reason to say no. Suppose you're in 1978, right? They haven't even started to properly write Empire Strikes Back yet. Is it true? Well, yeah. I mean, it feels like it is. But then what happens after the Empire Strikes Back is released? Well, it looks like it's not true. In fact, it is true. Vader is Luke's dad. So you get three kind of broad options with this. You have what's sometimes called temporalism, where the content of the fiction changes as subsequent episodes are released. So it was true, it was false that Vader is Luke's father. It became true once the second kind of episode was released. A worry here is that this can quickly lead to a kind of fictional nihilism, because there will be possible kind of canonical sequels that then say just something like, and everything before was a dream. And so all of that gets dumped. I mean, it's really shitty, but you have that sort of stuff in comic books, right? So you can have a different option, which is eternalism. This kind of comes back to this idea we were talking about way earlier, of there's a single fictional world, it's an epistemic thing. So in eternalism, it was always true that Vader is Luke's father. We just didn't have the right evidence for it. We needed to have the sequel in order to have the evidence to figure out that it was true. One weird thing with this kind of account is it runs into some oddities with things like Doyle's intention to kill Holmes in the final problem. He never wanted to bring Holmes back. He really wanted it to be the end, and was sort of drugged, kicking and screaming by his fans, and the need for some money, to revise and change what was the case, to bring Holmes back. So it seems really odd that in the, 8 years intervening there, he really was alive the whole time. It's no, that's clearly something you changed later. Retconning, right? If you think retconning can happen, eternalism just can't be right. The last option is to think that what we have are discrete fictions. So there's the fiction that is just A New Hope. Then there's the fiction that is A New Hope plus Empire Strikes Back. There's the fiction that's A New Hope, Empire Strikes Back, and Return of the Jedi, and so on as we add more sequels. So when we ask, is it true or false in A&H, asking, are you thinking about the fiction by itself or as part of this larger beast? So this is an idea, but the problem here is that it's very hard to then say, when you're watching A New Hope, which fiction are you watching? Looks like there's going to be potentially an infinite number here. So, yeah, sorry. There's some incompleteness stuff. This is just some fun. I will skip it. I want to end by first saying, thanks for that. I hope that was fun. And more generally, thank you for coming to the class. I hope that you've learned some things, but kind of more importantly, I hope that this has at least sparked some interest in some of these debates. I don't know how much you get some of these in other places, but I hope that it's been interesting and make you be more interested in some of these topics. Please fill out the evaluation form when it becomes available, whenever the 3rd is, sometime next week. And more importantly, good luck with all the exams and final papers and everything. Thanks for coming, guys. We'll see you soon. And sorry for taking over time.